White cops accuse a black woman, unaware. She's the state's chief prosecutor, ready to expose them. In a small town where prejudice simmers beneath polite smiles and silent streets, one fateful night ignites a firestorm that changes everything. A routine traffic stop spirals into a harrowing ordeal when two racist cops target a successful black woman, unaware she holds the highest prosecutorial power in the entire state. As hidden truths unravel, betrayal and corruption spill from the shadows, forcing everyone to confront their own darkness. Will justice triumph, or will hatred snuff out the light for good? Brace yourself for a storm of secrets, deceit, and retribution in a story that proves karma always finds its way home. Ebony Moore was 12 years old the first time she strode onto the podium of her middle school debate club in suburban Baltimore. Nervous energy roiled in her belly, but when she opened her mouth, the tremor in her voice receded. It was as if the whole world quieted just to hear her speak. Long after the gavel dropped, her classmates gaped in awe, and Ebony realized she possessed a gift for oration and an inextinguishable spark for justice. The experience galvanized her. By high school, she was captain of the debate team, star of the mock trial club, and famously known for her unshakable resolve. Her mother, Delilah Moore, a single parent working nights as a nurse at Johns Hopkins Hospital, instilled in Ebony a fierce work ethic. Growing up in a neighborhood where systemic prejudice often clouded the future of bright black youth, Ebony recognized that her talent was more than a personal boon. It was a responsibility. She wanted to fight not just for herself, but for those who never found their voice against injustice. Ebony's unwavering determination saw her through a full scholarship to Princeton, followed by a top-tier law school education. She excelled in her legal studies, completing internships at the highest levels, the Department of Justice, the ACLU, and a prestigious private firm. Even with these accomplishments, Ebony never forgot her humble roots. She volunteered in community legal clinics and offered pro bono counsel whenever she could. Upon returning to her home state, Ebony joined the state prosecutor's office. She rose through the ranks with astonishing speed. Her colleagues described her as relentless in pursuit of justice, but also empathetic, possessing that rare ability to see the human side of each case. She waged battle against institutional corruption, prosecuting white-collar crimes and championing reforms to police practices. When the state attorney general announced his early retirement, it was Ebony Moore, only 36 at the time, who was recommended to take the mantle of state's chief prosecutor. Despite some raised eyebrows from older officials who believed she was too young or too idealistic for such a massive responsibility, Ebony's record spoke for itself. Her strategy was simple: unwavering diligence paired with a nuanced understanding of the communities she served. Over time, the skeptics dwindled in number, and Ebony's reputation as a fair but firm hand of justice cemented itself statewide. Now, on paper, Ebony had become a powerhouse. In her heart, however, she was still that wide-eyed, determined girl who had first clutched a debate club podium at age 12. Her life was built on passion for truth, for fairness, and for the power of law when wielded for good. Little did she know, her next challenge would come in a way she never anticipated, on a quiet highway one evening, far from her office, far from the protective aura of her nameplate and title. And it would test not just her legal acumen, but her resilience as a human being in the face of raw, unbridled prejudice. 5 years into her career at the state prosecutor's office, Ebony Moore stood on the brink of a personal milestone. The moment arrived on a crisp January morning inside the polished oak confines of the state capitol building. She was to be sworn in as the newly appointed state's chief prosecutor, a position that placed her at the very pinnacle of legal authority in Maryland. Wearing a charcoal gray suit that accentuated her tall, poised silhouette, Ebony stepped into the chamber. Her mother was in the front row, eyes misting with pride. Members of the press, local legislators, and various colleagues filled the room. A state judge conducted the swearing-in ceremony, which Ebony accepted with humility. Cameras flashed in a flurry, capturing a historic image, the first black woman to hold this office in the state's history. Her acceptance speech was brief but resonant, a testament to her clarity of purpose. "I stand here on the shoulders of those who came before me, who fought relentlessly for equal rights in every sphere," she said, voice reverberating. "I vow to administer my duties fairly, to uphold the law, and most crucially, to protect the vulnerable and hold the powerful to account." In the weeks that followed, her appointment garnered national attention. The Washington Post ran a feature highlighting Ebony's rapid rise and her unwavering dedication to criminal justice reform. She was profiled on CNN, where she shared her vision for bridging the gap between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Her name was soon recognized in households far beyond Maryland's borders. With authority, however, came new burdens. Criticism and skepticism lurked around every corner, from those who labeled her soft on crime to those who saw her as an adversary of traditional policing. Yet Ebony's knowledge of the law and her ability to navigate the complexities of the system proved invaluable. She built alliances not just with fellow prosecutors, but also with progressive law enforcement leaders who sought to improve policing standards. Behind closed doors, Ebony worked tirelessly, authorizing key investigations, overseeing staff, and coordinating with local agencies. She believed in accountability at every level, once famously saying in an interview, "When we stand idle in the face of injustice, we undermine the very fabric of our democracy." During those early days, Ebony also invested in ongoing legal education for her team, instituted community outreach programs, and created specialized units to handle sensitive issues like hate crimes and police misconduct. She became known for crossing the state to hold town halls, bridging distance with direct conversation. Yet for all her accolades and power, Ebony remained deeply rooted in her personal life. She visited her mother regularly, often surprising her on weekends for breakfast at their favorite diner near downtown Baltimore. She tried to find time to unwind with friends, though her schedule rarely allowed it. A self-proclaimed workaholic, Ebony thrived on seeing results, closing cases, delivering justice, and keeping her promise to the people. Little did she suspect that her next test of mettle would not arise from a political adversary or a high-stakes trial. Instead, it would manifest in a remote corner of the state, orchestrated by those sworn to uphold the law, but corrupted by bigotry. Her battle would no longer be confined to the courthouse. It would be fought on the streets, against officers of the very same institution she so fervently believed could be redeemed. It was supposed to be a quick, discreet trip. Ebony had planned a day off, her first in months, to surprise her aging Aunt Bernice, who lived in a small town called Oakwood, nestled about 90 miles south of Baltimore. Aunt Bernice had raised Ebony for part of her childhood, and Ebony suspected her old caretaker had a health scare she was too proud to discuss. Setting off at dusk, Ebony felt an odd sense of calm as her sleek black sedan slid onto the interstate. Soft jazz murmured through the speakers, Miles Davis, one of her favorites. The sky was velvet black, scattered with pinpricks of starlight. With so many responsibilities piled on her shoulders, these rare moments alone were a balm. She could think, reflect, even breathe more deeply. Halfway through the drive, Ebony noticed she was low on gas. She pulled off the main highway, searching for a station. The route took her down narrower roads, past silent farmhouses and dark fields stretching endlessly under the moonlight. Distracted by her phone's navigation system, she didn't immediately notice the flashing blue lights trailing her car. When the sirens cut through the quiet, Ebony's heart clenched instinctively. She glanced at the speedometer. She wasn't speeding. There was no reason to be pulled over, no broken tail light. Could they be responding to an emergency? She slowed, signaling to let the police cruiser pass. Instead, it matched her pace, and the siren wailed more insistently. Realizing she was indeed being stopped, Ebony carefully pulled onto the shoulder. As she rolled down her window, Ebony felt a disquiet she hadn't experienced in years. She had defended innocent black motorists in court cases involving police misconduct, fought for them, argued for them, gathered evidence of racial profiling, and now she was in their shoes. It was a surreal, disconcerting feeling. A stiff-faced officer, stocky and ruddy-cheeked, approached her window. His name tag read Henderson. He made no eye contact, shining a bright flashlight into Ebony's car. Another officer, a lean man with pockmarked cheeks, Officer Miller, flanked the right side, hand hovering near his holster. Ebony extended her driver's license and registration calmly. She was, after all, not just a law-abiding citizen, but also the highest prosecutor in the state. That fact alone should have put this entire scenario to rest. But Ebony decided not to play that card right away. She wanted to observe how these officers handled a routine stop, if it was indeed routine. Henderson took the documents. "Driver's license says you're from Baltimore," he said, voice laced with suspicion. "What brings you out here this late?" Ebony tried to maintain composure. "I'm visiting family. Is there a problem, officer?" Henderson's gaze was cold, borderline hostile. "We got a report of a suspicious vehicle. You match the description." Ebony frowned. "Suspicious? In what way?" Henderson shrugged. "We ask the questions, ma'am. Step out of the car." An unspoken tension crackled in the night air. Ebony's pulse quickened. She was well aware she had done nothing to warrant stepping out of her vehicle, but in that moment she felt the weight of a history too often repeated. She gathered her breath, steadying her rising anger. If they were violating her rights, she needed to see how far they intended to take it. Because what would come next could be life-altering, not just for her, but for the two officers who had no idea who they were dealing with. Ebony opened the car door with deliberate care, keeping her hands visible. She had prosecuted enough cases to know how quickly tension could escalate if an officer claimed they felt threatened. The gravel crunched under her pumps as she stepped out. The night air was biting, laced with a faint smell of farmland. Behind her, headlights lit the scene in harsh white light, throwing elongated shadows across the deserted road. Officer Henderson glanced at Officer Miller, who moved in closer. Ebony could see the shape of his sidearm, the flickering reflection of the cruiser's lights on its metal. She refused to show fear, although her stomach churned. If this was simply a ruse, some misguided attempt to fish for contraband or to intimidate, they'd soon realize the enormity of their mistake. "Place your hands on the hood," Henderson ordered. Ebony pressed her palms onto the cool metal of her sedan. She felt her heart pounding in her chest as Henderson began patting her down, far more aggressively than any routine search warranted. The tension thickened when he lingered unnecessarily at her waist and hips. Ebony closed her eyes, outraged at the impropriety. Yet she resisted the urge to snap at him. She needed to remain calm. A single outburst might be twisted into resisting arrest. "What exactly are you looking for?" she asked, her voice carefully measured. Henderson sneered but said nothing. After the pat-down, he opened her car door and rummaged through the interior. Documents fell out of her briefcase, notes on pending trials, sensitive legal papers. He held one folder up to the cruiser's floodlight, trying to read the letterhead. Ebony turned, stepping away from the hood. "That's confidential. You have no right to look at my legal files without cause or a warrant. Step away from my property." This seemed to provoke Henderson. He slammed the folder onto the passenger seat. "Listen, lady, we have the right to conduct a search on suspicion. Don't tell me how to do my job." Before Ebony could respond, Officer Miller interjected, "We got a tip about a car matching your description, possibly transporting drugs. We're well within our rights to check for them." Ebony's mind whirled. A tip? She doubted it. She glanced up at their badges again. Henderson, Miller, two local cops from Oakwood's small department. She tried to recall if she'd ever seen their names in any complaint or misconduct case that crossed her desk. No immediate recollections came to mind, but she'd have her staff run a check later. For now, she needed to handle this carefully. Drug trafficking. Really? Ebony straightened, clasping her hands together. Officer, I'm an attorney. Henderson cut her off with a bark. Like I said, you let us handle this. You can keep your mouth shut, or we'll have to take you in. Miller was circling around her car, tugging on the trunk handle. It was locked, of course, so he started rapping on the back window with his flashlight. Ebony's indignation flared. This was not a routine stop. It was a fishing expedition, fueled by bigotry and intimidation tactics. She considered revealing her identity. Yet a part of her hesitated. She wanted to see how far they would push, how blatantly they would violate a driver's rights. In court, evidence of their misconduct would be crucial. However, a deeper instinct cautioned her. If she didn't reveal who she was, how dangerous could this get? "Is there a reason you're harassing me?" Ebony asked. Her voice trembled with a thinly veiled blend of fear and anger. Miller smirked. "Harassing? We're doing our duty to protect this town." The fury rising within Ebony was tempered by the understanding that her next move needed to be calculated. She glanced at her phone, lying inside the car. If she could just grab it, make a quick call. But she doubted these officers would allow that without an excuse for violence. Yet Ebony, being who she was, wouldn't cower. She summoned her inner resolve, determined that if they were going to walk the path of corruption and racism, then she would have no choice but to unleash the full weight of the law upon them. The tension reached a breaking point when Miller insisted on opening Ebony's trunk. By now, Ebony's patience wore thin. She had not resisted, nor had she behaved suspiciously. On the contrary, she had cooperated, even though the entire stop reeked of discrimination. She made her stance clear, telling them outright they had no legitimate probable cause, but her words only served to agitate the officers further. Growing irate, Henderson pulled out a pair of handcuffs from his belt and gestured for Ebony to turn around. "You want to do this the hard way?" he spat. "I'll place you under arrest for obstructing an investigation." Ebony's jaw tightened. She felt her chest tighten with mounting outrage. She had spent her career fighting for exactly this scenario, defending those unjustly targeted. Yet experiencing it firsthand was a blow to her sense of security. From a distance, she could see passing headlights flicker as cars occasionally glided by on the main road, completely oblivious to the injustice unfolding on this lonely stretch of asphalt. "Obstruction?" she repeated. "You've got no basis." Henderson clamped a cuff on her left wrist, yanking her arm backward with a force that sent a spike of pain through her shoulder. Ebony had been through use-of-force training in the academy days, a requirement for all prosecutors who handled certain specialized cases. She recognized the maneuver as unnecessarily harsh. "Now is not the time to play lawyer," Henderson growled. "You're under arrest. Let's see how tough you are back at the station." Miller unlocked the trunk with the key Ebony had left in the ignition and rummaged through her neatly packed bag. A change of clothes, some files for her aunt's medical forms, and a small toiletry kit. Finding nothing incriminating, he tossed her belongings aside carelessly. By now, Ebony's head pounded with a swirl of emotions, anger, humiliation, even a small measure of fear. Would they take her to the station? How would she contact her colleagues or family? She knew she had every legal right to reveal herself, to put an end to this charade. But something inside her whispered that she should wait, gather as much evidence of their blatant misconduct as possible. Of course, that meant enduring the ordeal a bit longer. Handcuffed and disoriented, Ebony was led to the back seat of the police cruiser. The stale odor of sweat and synthetic leather enveloped her. Henderson slid in behind the wheel, while Miller took the passenger seat. The two officers exchanged triumphant glances, as though they had just netted a major criminal. Ebony struggled to control her outrage. Tears threatened to well in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer indignity of it all. As they pulled away, Ebony looked back at her sedan, abandoned on the roadside. The trunk hung open, her personal effects scattered. A sense of unreality weighed on her. She, the state's chief prosecutor, was under arrest, detained without cause by two small-town officers. She wondered how quickly they'd realize the catastrophic mistake they were making. Perhaps it wouldn't dawn on them until her staff called, or until they tried to run her fingerprints. Or maybe they would continue to revel in their power trip, fueling a fire that would explode the moment she stepped into a courtroom. In that moment, Ebony vowed this wouldn't end with her quietly walking away. She would see to it that Henderson and Miller and every complicit individual in the station faced the consequences of their racism and abuse of authority. The question was, how far would they go before realizing they were setting themselves up for a reckoning from which there would be no escape? Oakwood Police Station was a squat, unimposing structure nestled behind the town's main square. On one side stood a modest post office, on the other a bar frequented by old-timers. The station's exterior was all dull brickwork, illuminated by a lone streetlight that flickered ominously. Henderson and Miller ushered Ebony inside through a back entrance typically reserved for processing. A stale, institutional smell of bleach and old coffee pervaded the halls. Flickering fluorescent lights cast an anemic glow. Ebony could have been any suspect, a petty criminal, a vagrant, rather than the highest-ranking prosecutor in the state. The booking desk was manned by a bored-looking clerk who raised an eyebrow when he saw Ebony in cuffs. "Who's this?" he asked, lazily swiveling a pen between his fingers. "Drug suspect," Henderson stated flatly. "Caught her on the back roads. She was refusing a lawful search." Miller nudged Ebony forward. "She got mouthy, tried to talk her way out of it. Doesn't have any drugs on her, but I'm sure we'll find something in her car. We'll have K9 do a thorough check soon." Ebony bit down on her lip. She could speak up, say, "I'm Ebony Moore, the state's chief prosecutor, and you two have lost your minds." But a calm resolve stilled her tongue. She wanted them to dig deeper into their own hole. She needed them to commit their misconduct in full view of witnesses, so there would be no question of what transpired. The clerk shrugged, typed a few notes, then pressed a button to open a heavy steel door leading deeper into the station. Inside, Ebony passed a dim corridor lined with holding cells. She felt eyes from behind the bars, mostly men, some who looked disheveled and beaten down by life. Whispers trailed her, a few catcalls. It was a humiliating gauntlet. Henderson guided her to an interrogation room, just 4 bare walls, a scuffed metal table, and a single overhead light. He removed her cuffs, gesturing for her to sit. Then he stood by the door with a self-satisfied grin. Officer Miller loomed behind him, arms crossed. "I want my phone call," Ebony said, controlling the tremor in her voice. "Sure," Henderson snorted. "But first we have questions. Who do you work for? How do you afford that fancy sedan? Any priors?" Ebony folded her hands. "I'm invoking my right to remain silent until I have an attorney present." Henderson smirked, glancing at Miller. "She knows the lines. Must watch a lot of cop shows." Miller chuckled. "This might take a while." He tossed Ebony's purse onto the table, rummaging through it. He found her wallet, flipping to her driver's license. A fleeting flicker of confusion crossed his face. Did he notice the name Ebony Moore? Perhaps it seemed familiar. But neither he nor Henderson reacted openly. Ebony wondered if these officers were truly clueless or willfully ignorant. After all, her appointment as state's chief prosecutor had made local headlines. But Oakwood might be the kind of insular town where news from the big city barely registered. Or perhaps these men simply didn't care who she was, confident that their power would trump any complaint. As the minutes dragged on, Ebony steeled herself. She would have her phone call. She would contact her office, her staff, maybe even the local news stations. By the time this was over, Oakwood PD would be under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. She could feel it in her bones. This was a turning point, not just for her, but for any marginalized person who had suffered at the hands of officers like Henderson and Miller. The reckoning was coming. Night gave way to the faint light of early morning before Ebony was finally granted her phone call. The two officers had left her alone in the interrogation room for hours, likely assuming that prolonged isolation would intimidate her into compliance, but Ebony used the time to mentally draft a plan of action. She would reveal her identity at precisely the right moment, ensuring maximum accountability. Her only concern was Aunt Bernice, who would be worried sick when Ebony never arrived. When a weary junior officer, his name tag reading Ramirez, entered with a roll of his eyes, Ebony seized the opportunity. "I'd like to place a call now," she said, her tone commanding but not hostile. Ramirez shrugged, led her to a desk phone in a corner of the station, and handed her the receiver without a word. Ebony punched in the number to her chief assistant, Marcus Avery. He answered groggily, as it was still well before dawn. The moment Ebony identified herself, his voice shot up in alarm. "Boss? Where are you?" "Marcus," she said quietly, "I'm at the Oakwood police station, about 90 miles south of Baltimore. I've been wrongfully arrested and detained. I need you to contact the Attorney General's office and come here immediately. Bring the press if you can." His shock crackled through the line. Wait, what happened?" Ebony exhaled. "Racial profiling, harassment, false arrest. It's all on these officers. We can't let them sweep this under the rug. I need you here ASAP." Marcus assured her he'd call in reinforcements, including Ebony's personal security detail and a handful of attorneys who specialized in civil rights litigation. She hung up, feeling a wave of relief. Now time was on her side. They would descend upon Oakwood PD like a storm. When Ebony turned, she found Officer Ramirez standing awkwardly. He scratched his head as though he suspected something momentous had just transpired. "We'll, need to take you back to the interrogation room," he mumbled. Back in that claustrophobic space, Ebony folded her arms. Henderson and Miller re-entered a while later, smugness radiating from every pore. "So, ready to talk?" Henderson taunted. Ebony stayed silent, her confidence buoyed by the knowledge that her team was on the way. She watched as the officers exchanged puzzled glances. They had evidently expected some kind of groveling or confession by now. An hour crawled by. The phone at the front desk began ringing off the hook. Ebony imagined the chaos, calls from the Attorney General's office, from major news outlets, from the governor's staff even. The clamor was growing, and Henderson and Miller appeared increasingly uneasy. Finally, a tall figure with silver-rimmed glasses stormed into the interrogation room. Ebony recognized him as Lieutenant Kavanaugh, presumably the highest-ranking officer in Oakwood PD. He was red-faced, breath-labored. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded of Henderson and Miller. Then he turned to Ebony. "And you, who are you, that all these phone calls are coming in about?" Ebony rose from the cold metal chair, meeting Kavanaugh's eyes. "I am Ebony Moore," she said, voice resonating with quiet authority. "The state's chief prosecutor. I was pulled over last night without cause, manhandled, my personal items searched without a warrant, and I've been held here ever since." A hush fell over the room, so profound one could almost hear hearts stop. Henderson and Miller gaped like fish out of water, their smug expressions replaced by shock and perhaps a hint of terror. Lieutenant Kavanaugh swore under his breath, raking a hand through his thinning hair. He seemed paralyzed, uncertain whether to scold his subordinates or try to appease Ebony. Henderson managed a stammer. "Chief Prosecutor." "That's not possible. You—" Ebony cut him off, stepping closer. "Yes, the same Ebony Moore whose name is on statewide bulletins. And your name, Officer Henderson, is about to be on a complaint for abuse of power." Miller paled, inching away from the confrontation. Kavanaugh cleared his throat, glancing back and forth between Ebony and his officers. The air crackled with the weight of imminent consequences. In that moment, Ebony knew that the story had only begun. The final chapter would be written in courtrooms and headlines, ensuring justice was served. The station lobby transformed into a chaotic scene within the hour. Marcus Avery arrived first, accompanied by two members of Ebony's security detail, stone-faced individuals who looked ready to storm the gates if necessary. They swept into the station with an air of authority that unsettled the local officers. Not far behind them came a small contingent of reporters from the Baltimore Sun and a local TV station. Cameras flashed, and the flustered clerk at the front desk futilely tried to maintain order. In the interrogation room, Ebony watched the unfolding drama through a small, one-way window. Lieutenant Kavanaugh seemed ready to break into hives. He pulled Ebony aside, gesturing to the officers milling about. "Ms. Moore, I assure you, this is a misunderstanding. We respect you and your office." Ebony gave a humorless laugh. "A misunderstanding? Your officers ignored my rights, racially profiled me, forcibly searched my vehicle and person, then detained me for hours. I do not consider that a mere misunderstanding, Lieutenant." Henderson and Miller hovered near the doorway, their postures stiff, faces slick with perspiration. The smugness that had fueled them earlier dissolved into a toxic mix of fear and confusion. They had stepped on a landmine without even realizing it. Meanwhile, Ebony's chief assistant and the security detail waded through the growing throng, eventually reaching her side. Marcus wore a grim expression. She could almost see the wheels turning in his mind, gauging how best to handle the PR fallout. The security officers flanked Ebony as if she were a dignitary under threat. In a sense, she was, though the threat had come from the very people tasked with upholding the law. Kavanaugh tried to salvage the situation by offering Ebony a private office to calm down. She narrowed her eyes. "What I'd really like is access to my possessions and the immediate release of my vehicle from impound. Then I'd like a full statement on record admitting this was an unlawful detention." "Of course," Kavanaugh stammered. "Anything you need, Ms. Moore." Ebony stepped forward. "I also need to ensure that your officers, Henderson and Miller, are suspended pending an internal investigation for racial profiling and abuse of authority." Kavanaugh's face contorted with suppressed frustration. He nodded jerkily, but Ebony could see the conflict behind his eyes. He probably wanted to protect his own, but he also recognized the unassailable position Ebony occupied, a powerful state official who had the law on her side. "Fine," Kavanaugh relented. "They'll be placed on administrative leave immediately, pending a departmental review." Ebony turned, fixing Henderson and Miller with a cool stare. "This isn't over. By the time I'm done, everyone will know your names, your faces, and the way you treat innocent civilians." Marcus approached, offering Ebony her phone. Notifications blazed across the screen, calls from the governor's office, media inquiries, messages from outraged community members. Ebony inhaled deeply, resolving to make her next moves precise and unassailable. She would not be satisfied with a quiet apology or a face-saving measure from Oakwood PD. This was now a matter of public interest, a moment to force systemic change on a department that had clearly lost its moral compass. Henderson tried one last gambit, stepping forward. "Look, Ms. Moore, we were just following procedure. We had intel about a suspicious car." Ebony faced him, voice brimming with controlled fury. "Your so-called intel was a fabrication. Don't insult my intelligence. You targeted me because of the color of my skin and the out-of-town plates. And now the entire state will see what's happening in Oakwood." Henderson opened his mouth as if to argue, but nothing came out. He looked at Miller, then at Kavanaugh, who gave him a curt shake of the head. Ebony found herself unexpectedly pitying them in that moment, mired in their own ignorance, about to be swallowed by consequences they never saw coming. But she quelled that pity. Justice demanded accountability, and Ebony Moore was more than prepared to deliver it. Freed from the station, Ebony stood outside under the rising sun, her newly released sedan parked nearby. The crisp morning air felt more alive than usual, carrying the scent of imminent confrontation. Reporters closed in on her, microphones and cameras jostling for space. Ebony recognized she couldn't remain silent. This was bigger than her personal ordeal. It was a chance to shine a glaring light on police misconduct. Marcus gently led her toward the impromptu press gaggle. She held up a hand to quiet them before speaking clearly. Last night, I was wrongfully detained and subjected to harassment by officers Henderson and Miller from the Oakwood Police Department. This was a blatant act of racial profiling, combined with a reckless disregard for constitutional rights. As the state's chief prosecutor, I will ensure that justice is served, not only for myself, but for any individual who has ever been targeted in this manner. A flurry of questions erupted. Will you press charges? Are the officers fired? What about the department's official response? Ebony answered with measured gravity. I intend to pursue every legal avenue at my disposal. We're talking civil rights violations, potential criminal misconduct, and departmental negligence. No one is above the law, including those sworn to uphold it. That statement echoed through the small town. Within hours, national outlets picked up the story, featuring Ebony's face on news segments across the country. Her staff back in Baltimore set up a war room, coordinating with civil rights attorneys, local activists, and community leaders who had long suspected Oakwood's police of discriminatory practices. Ebony's phone buzzed relentlessly. Calls from political allies, from old law school friends, even from community organizers who saw her as a hero, and from Aunt Bernice, worried out of her mind. After ensuring her aunt's health was stable, Ebony promised to visit soon. I'm sorry, Auntie, she said softly into the phone. I'll make this right, and then I'll come see you. In the meantime, the Oakwood PD tried to salvage its reputation. A hastily called press conference, led by a visibly agitated Lieutenant Kavanaugh, declared that the department would conduct a thorough internal review. But Ebony's team wasn't about to let them sweep anything under the rug. They filed an immediate request for body cam footage, station records, and any dash cam recordings from Henderson and Miller's vehicle. Behind closed doors, Ebony and Marcus worked with a cadre of attorneys. Each piece of evidence would be meticulously compiled. Ebony wanted to trace every complaint ever filed against Oakwood PD to unearth a pattern of systemic injustice if it existed. She also reached out to leaders of the local NAACP branch, forging alliances and gathering testimonials from residents who had experienced similar harassment. On top of legal maneuvering, Ebony had to keep up with her duties as state's chief prosecutor. High-profile cases demanded her attention. Criminals still needed to be held accountable. But in her rare moments of downtime, Ebony found her thoughts drawn to that humiliating night. The feel of the cold handcuffs, the cruelty in Henderson's voice, and the stark reminder that her position, her power, did not shield her from the legacy of prejudice. Still, Ebony was no victim. She was a force. Any fleeting moment of vulnerability was replaced by a burning resolve to see this through to the end. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with opposition, from the police union, from conservative commentators, and possibly from within the legal establishment itself. But Ebony had come too far, fought too hard, to shrink back now. This would be the fight of her life, and she was ready to wage it in the name of all who dared to hope for justice in an unjust world. Just 2 weeks after the incident, the first legal salvo was fired. Ebony's civil rights attorneys, backed by advocacy groups, filed a comprehensive lawsuit against officers Henderson and Miller, as well as Oakwood PD. The suit alleged constitutional violations, false arrest, and racial profiling. The legal complaint cited Ebony's personal testimony and sought to demonstrate a pattern of misconduct through other residents' experiences. Within days, state and national media converged on Oakwood for the initial hearing. News vans clogged the narrow streets, journalists packed the local diner, and TV cameras set up outside the county courthouse. Each day, Ebony arrived flanked by her legal team and supportive colleagues. In stark contrast, Henderson and Miller walked in wearing tight-lipped expressions, their lawyers trailing behind with scowling faces. Presiding over the case was Judge Ainsley Romero, known for her no-nonsense approach. She wasted no time demanding full disclosure of any police camera footage. Oakwood PD's counsel tried to argue for limited release. Ebony's team countered with well-cited case law. After a tense back and forth, Judge Romero sided with Ebony. Public interest outweighs privacy in this context, she declared. Produce the footage immediately. That evening, Ebony and her attorneys reviewed the dashcam video. Though the audio was garbled in places, the sight of Henderson and Miller forcibly cuffing Ebony without proper grounds was damning. Additionally, internal radio transmissions from the station included chilling remarks. "We got one from Baltimore," and "check if she's carrying anything, you know how they are." The language was coded, but the intention was clear. Another blow landed on Oakwood PD when Ebony's investigators discovered that Henderson had multiple complaints on his record. Minorities in the community had repeatedly reported rough treatment, but the complaints were systematically dismissed as unfounded. A local whistleblower came forward anonymously, claiming an unwritten policy existed to keep outsiders out. Ebony's attorneys added these revelations to the expanding legal case. Public sentiment began to shift. Residents of Oakwood who once trusted their small-town cops started asking uncomfortable questions. Others, particularly those who felt racially targeted, spoke out, their bravery spurred by Ebony's example. Town hall meetings erupted in heated debates, and the mayor found himself fending off calls for a complete overhaul of the police department. Meanwhile, Ebony maintained her composure, refusing to let anger consume her. She channeled her energy into the lawsuit, ensuring every angle was covered, legally and morally. She knew this case was bigger than personal vindication. It was an emblem of how systemic abuse festers when left unchecked. As proceedings advanced, Ebony also faced backlash. The police union accused her of grandstanding and political theatrics. Conservative talk show hosts decried her attack on law enforcement, arguing she was undermining good officers everywhere. But Ebony stood firm. "A good officer respects the law and the public they serve," she told a local news station. "When we talk about accountability, we're ensuring that law enforcement upholds the very standards they're sworn to protect." Each court appearance brought the case closer to trial. Henderson and Miller, in their depositions, tried to paint Ebony as belligerent, even dangerous. Yet their claims contradicted the dashcam footage. They stammered under cross-examination, struggling to justify their actions. Meanwhile, Ebony's star witnesses, residents who had faced similar harassment, bolstered the argument that Oakwood PD had cultivated a culture of racial bias. In the swirl of legal battles and media coverage, Ebony found moments of solace in the unwavering support of her mother, Aunt Bernice, and her closest friends. Each day she re-entered the courthouse with renewed purpose. The nation watched, and Ebony intended to show them what it meant to fight back against an unjust system. As the court battles intensified, Ebony felt the crush of her responsibilities from all sides. By day, she served as Maryland's chief prosecutor, tackling everything from organized crime cases to political corruption. By night, she pored over evidence against Oakwood PD with a team of civil rights lawyers, forging the unassailable legal strategy that she hoped would set a nationwide precedent. The emotional toll weighed heavily on her. Sleep became a rare commodity, disturbed by nightmares that replayed her humiliating arrest. She found herself startling whenever she passed a police cruiser on the street, even though she was the law's highest enforcer in the state. Memories of that cold, lonely stretch of road haunted her. Still, Ebony refused to let fear hold her back. She saw a therapist, determined not to let trauma undermine her life's work. Outside the courtroom, social media lit up with heated debates. The hashtags "None Justice for Ebony" and "End Racial Profiling" trended across various platforms. Civil rights activists organized peaceful demonstrations in Oakwood calling for broader police reform. Counter-protesters also appeared, clutching signs supporting our brave cops and attacking Ebony as a radical with an agenda. The small town found itself thrust onto a national stage with swirling narratives of racism, power, and accountability. Ebony also faced unexpected hostility from certain political figures. A senior state senator, known for his pro-police stances, accused her of waging a witch hunt. Behind closed doors, Ebony received veiled warnings that her political capital might wane if she continued. Yet she stood firm, unwavering in her conviction that justice mattered more than career maneuvering. The day Ebony testified in court was a watershed moment. The gallery was packed. Reporters and members of the public craned their necks to catch every detail. She recounted the night of her arrest in calm, measured tones, describing how Henderson and Miller singled her out, demanded she exit her vehicle, and aggressively handcuffed her without probable cause. The dashcam video played in the background, corroborating her every word. Audible gasps filled the courtroom when the officer's derogatory comments were heard. Henderson's lawyer tried to rattle Ebony with sharp cross-examination. Isn't it possible that Officer Henderson simply made an error in judgment, believing he was acting for public safety? Ebony's eyes blazed. An error in judgment implies a momentary lapse. This was a systemic failure. The language they used, their manner, and the department's history all point to a deeper problem, one that endangers innocent people, especially people of color. The tension in the room was palpable. Not long after, Henderson's co-counsel attempted to pivot, claiming Ebony's high-profile status had biased the investigation. But Ebony remained poised. My status doesn't negate the fact that I was racially profiled. If anything, it highlights how this type of misconduct can happen to anyone, from any walk of life. That night, as Ebony finally reached home, she stood in her living room gazing at a framed photo of her younger self in front of the Supreme Court building, taken during a law school field trip. She'd been so full of hope then, so certain that the law was the great equalizer. That belief, though battered, remained unbroken. If she achieved nothing else, Ebony would make certain that Oakwood PD and any department with similar practices would not be allowed to operate in the shadows any longer. The final day of the trial arrived amid swirling tensions. Oakwood's small courthouse overflowed with spectators, activists, media crews, and curious locals eager to witness history. Judge Romero took her seat, her expression grave. Months of legal wrangling, depositions, cross-examinations, and public outcry had led to this pinnacle moment. Ebony sat calmly with her legal team, her gaze unwavering as Henderson, Miller, and Oakwood PD's counsel occupied the defense table. Whispers buzzed through the courtroom while everyone awaited the judge's decision. The room hushed when Romero cleared her throat, her gaze sweeping across the assembled audience. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, she began, including dash-cam recordings, station logs, and witness testimonies, it is the court's opinion that Officers Henderson and Miller acted with willful disregard for Ms. Moore's constitutional rights. Their conduct was biased, discriminatory, and in violation of standard police procedure. A collective exhale rippled through the crowd. Some clapped softly, but Judge Romero raised her hand, silencing them. The Oakwood Police Department, through a history of neglected complaints, facilitated an environment that allowed such misconduct to flourish. Therefore, the department shares responsibility for these actions. I order that Ms. Moore be awarded damages for violation of her civil rights. Further, I call upon state authorities to conduct a thorough review of Oakwood PD's operations. Beside Ebony, Marcus discreetly squeezed her hand in triumph. Henderson and Miller stared ahead, their faces ashen. Onlookers snapped photos, capturing the moment for posterity. For a brief second, Ebony met Henderson's gaze. In those eyes, she saw fear and resentment. She almost pitied him, but justice demanded accountability. So many people were harmed by his kind of prejudice, and Ebony's victory was also theirs. Outside, sunlight poured onto the courthouse steps, where a throng of supporters and journalists awaited her. Ebony made a statement, her voice resolute. This verdict is a step toward ensuring that every person, no matter their race or background, is treated with dignity by law enforcement. My hope is that we can use this moment as a catalyst for broader reforms, not just in Oakwood, but statewide. Cheers erupted, mixed with the murmur of shuttering cameras. As Ebony waded through reporters, she spotted Aunt Bernice in the crowd. The older woman beamed with pride, tears sparkling in her eyes. Ebony embraced her gently, feeling a burden lift. The fight had been painful, even scarring, but necessary. In the weeks that followed, the governor ordered a full investigation into the Oakwood Police Department. Several high-ranking officers resigned, and the department committed to implementing sensitivity training, body cams for all patrol units, and an external oversight board. Henderson and Miller faced criminal charges for their actions, ultimately resulting in convictions that sent a clear message: racism and abuse of power would not go unpunished. Ebony continued her work as chief prosecutor with renewed vigor. She partnered with various organizations to advance statewide policy changes aimed at eradicating racial profiling. While the road to true reform was long, this victory was a testament to the impact of one resolute individual standing up against injustice. And so, life carried on. But for the people of Oakwood and for anyone who read the headlines, one resounding truth emerged: justice, though sometimes delayed, cannot be denied. Karma, as it turned out, had an iron hand, and when it struck, it left no doubt that accountability was both swift and final. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey of triumph against injustice. Ebony Moore's story reminds us that even the most powerful among us are not immune to prejudice, but also that courage and resolve can dismantle oppressive systems. If this tale resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with your friends to spread the message that racial profiling has no place in our society. And if you want to hear more stories that shed light on hidden truths and celebrate those who refuse to be silenced, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Together, we can keep these important conversations going, hold wrongdoers accountable, and shine a beacon of hope for those who've lost faith in justice. Your engagement fuels our mission to spotlight stories that inspire change, so stay tuned, stay passionate, and stay committed to justice for all.